Welcome, friends, to Books of the Book. We're so glad you've joined us for our study of the book of Daniel. I'm Ty Gibson, and with me is my co-host, James Rafferty.
It is good to be here, Ty. We're in Daniel chapter 5. We're dealing here with another chapter in the experience or in the life of a Babylonian ruler. This time it is Belshazzar. And this chapter is really interesting because it dwells on a different aspect of God's character. God is a God of love. And His love, that loving aspect of God's character, that the foundation of who He is, of His government, is manifested in two different ways, in mercy and in justice.
Right.
And mercy and justice seem to be opposites, but they come together to form that character of love, that foundational principle of love that is the essence of who God is.
Daniel chapter 5, James, I think is a study in contrast in that sense. We see in chapter 4 and the previous chapters of the book of Daniel the gradual but finally radical conversion of King Nebuchadnezzar as he comes under the influence of God's mercy and grace. And then when we come to chapter 5, we have this contrast with his son, or actually it's his grandson, Belshazzar, who is himself a witness to God's mercy, to God's grace. I mean, he saw and knows the history of his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. He knows God's influence, His mercy, His grace. At least he knows it intellectually as a witness to it. And yet, Belshazzar does not respond to God's mercy as did Nebuchadnezzar, but in fact responds in such a way that ultimately works his ruin.
Yes, and one of the reasons for this is found right here in the opening verses, Daniel 5, beginning with verse 1. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and he drank wine before the 1,000, and it says in verse 2, Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and the silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his wives, princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink there.
It's no secret, James. Everybody knows that alcohol impairs judgment. The language here is while he tasted the wine. That is, that Belshazzar, while under the influence of alcohol, while under the influence of this massive party that he's holding with just drunkenness at every turn, he is under the influence of alcohol, and his judgment is severely impaired. He begins to make decisions that are, in a sense, I mean, not even in a sense, I mean, directly defying the God of heaven that he has witnessed as an influence in Nebuchadnezzar's life. He defies the God of heaven. He enters into a state of mind and a series of actions that are disrespectful and irreverent. He takes the vessels of the house of God, the temple of God in Jerusalem, and he makes them a part of his drunken feast.
Absolutely. And you know, what's interesting here, Ty, is the principle that we find in the Bible. You know, in the book of Proverbs, we are warned against partaking of alcoholic drinks, alcoholic beverages, not even to look upon wine when it ferments, when it changes, because the influence that it has upon us tends in the wrong direction. And I'm sure there are a lot of people out there listening, myself included, who can point to the influence of alcohol, the influence of drugs, and say, you know, I made decisions in my life, I took actions in my life that were detrimental, that I've possibly never recovered from, or that have taken my life in a direction that I never wanted or intended. And if I wouldn't have been under the influence of those drugs or of that alcohol, I would have gone in a completely different direction.
Yes.
It's ruined my life. It's impaired me. But I want to say to all those people right now that it doesn't mean that God cannot recover you from that. And that's why it's so important for us to recognize that, yes, there is a place where we can make decisions that bring us to a destiny that is not in harmony with God's will, a destiny of being lost, which is what we're going to find here with Belshazzar. But there's also a place where God can recover us, and God longs to recover us from the decisions we made while under the influence of these drugs.
So we have here in Daniel chapter 5 a study in contrast between the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar and now the very clear rebellion and irreverence of Belshazzar. And we have here a clear indication or a contrast between the effect of God's mercy and now the necessity of God responding injustice. So as Belshazzar is engaged in this drunken feast, as he enters into these irreverent actions, shaking, as it were, his fist at the God of heaven, suddenly something astounding takes place. In verse 5, in that same hour, the finger of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the man's hand that wrote. Amazing, just out of nowhere, no doubt under the influence of alcohol, he's doing a double take and wondering, is this real, what I'm witnessing? But obviously he's not the only person seeing it. There are 1,000 of his guests here at this feast, and they're all witnessing this blood-curdling, haunting thing that's taking place. I mean, imagine what you would feel, what I would feel, if all of a sudden out of nowhere, a hand, a bodiless hand, begins writing across the wall.
And he is filled with fear. And one of the reasons why he is so filled with fear is because he doesn't understand what the writing means.
Right.
So here comes this bodiless hand, and he's writing these words, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, and he's trying to understand, and he has no understanding of what these words actually mean.
Yes.
He knows it's significant. This is a supernatural event that has taken place. And probably his conscience is awakened at that moment, and he is brought to sobriety in a second.
Yes.
And he's wondering, what does this mean? It can't be a positive thing. It must be a fearful boding of the future. But what does it all mean? And there is nothing as scary, there's nothing as fearful as not understanding what the future holds.
Yes, he's so terrified, in fact, that verse 6 of Daniel chapter 5 says that the joints of his hips were loosened. Another version says that his loins were loosened. Some commentators say that maybe he became incontinent at this point. He was so afraid. And it says there in verse 6 that his knees knocked against each other. I mean, this guy was terrified. Sin has that effect on us. When the conscience is heavy laden with guilt and condemnation, and somewhere in our hearts we know that we're wrong and that we're walking contrary to the will of God, that weight of guilt upon our conscience, it has the potential to produce terror and fear in us when we finally come face to face with the truth. And as you say, his conscience to some degree is awakened right now, and he knows he's in trouble. He knows in his heart that something is taking place there that is not in his favor.
And it's really interesting because at this point, Belshazzar wants to understand what the writing is. And there are probably many times in our lives and many times in the lives of our viewers when we're not interested in knowing what God has to say about our future. We're not interested in understanding prophecy or in understanding this mysterious writing that comes from heaven, because we understand now in the context of this prophecy, of this book, that this writing is from God. It's a warning from God. We're not interested. And that's why it's so important for us to recognize, because see, a lot of people think that prophecy in the Bible is all doom and gloom and it's all written to make us afraid. And the truth of the matter is, it is uncertainty about the future. It is lacking knowledge and lacking understanding that we need to be afraid of.
Yes.
And Belshazzar's story is bringing this out. God has not given us prophecy to scare us. God has revealed prophecy to prepare us for what is ahead. And you look at our situation in the world today at any time and you think, well, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what the economic future of this country, of the world is, and that's scary. But to be able to see what the future holds, even if it isn't the best, it gives a little bit of peace, because it gives us a sense that we can do or need to do, or what we need, a sense of what we need to do in order to prepare. Even if it is the worst, we can do something to prepare for it. But not knowing it all is even scarier. And that's why when the king seeks for an interpretation and can't find one, it says, verse 9, that then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. In other words, as fearful and as afraid as he was the first time, he was even more afraid when nobody could be found to interpret interpret this writing.
And just like his grandfather before him, Nebuchadnezzar, he calls in the wise men, the astrologers. They can't give the interpretation, and somehow he had to know the history. He had to know the history, but somehow he doesn't even think of Daniel. He doesn't. His queen comes to him and says, there is a man, in verse 11, there is a man in your kingdom. in whom is the Spirit of the holy God. And then the queen calls his attention to Daniel, and immediately Daniel, of course, is called upon and brought in before the king, and the king begins pleading with Daniel for an interpretation of the dream. And as the interpretation comes to the king, it is not what he wants to hear.
And obviously it says in verse 10 that the queen was not in the banquet. So you see the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. So it appears that she was not under the influence of these drugs, of alcohol, and of the party atmosphere. And she was not a part of that. And so she can still recollect. She can still remember. She can pinpoint to the king this man named Daniel. When the king is out of his senses, has lost his senses, he knows about Daniel. He knows about the history, but he has forgotten. This is the influence drugs can have upon us. He has forgotten about everything that God has wrought, everything that God has done. He should know, but he doesn't know.
And I love the way she identifies Daniel, and he's identified by this same terminology repeatedly throughout the story here with Nebuchadnezzar and now with Belshazzar. This is the one in whom is the Spirit of the holy God. I mean, wouldn't that be incredible if in our daily lives and in our interactions with people who don't know and necessarily believe in the Lord, wouldn't it be great if we were living in such a way, with integrity as Daniel did, purposing in our hearts not to defile ourselves as Daniel purposed in his heart, but walking in integrity, not just walking in integrity in any kind of haughty, religious, spiritually superior sense, because as we've seen in previous studies, James, Daniel is a humble man who is not filled with resentment and bitterness for the fact that he's been taken as a slave into Babylon and made a eunuch and made to serve the king. Daniel, in the first time we encounter his response to his enemies is, Lord, don't destroy the wise men.
He's a humble
King
man.
Nebuchadnezzar, don't destroy the wise men. And then again later on, he is concerned that Nebuchadnezzar see the truth, but at the same time he's reluctant to tell him the whole truth because he knows that it's not what Nebuchadnezzar wants to hear. And here, Daniel has built a reputation, and his reputation is, this is the one in whom, this is a man in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God.
Yeah, verse 12, for as much as an excellent spirit, an excellent spirit. What's an excellent spirit? It's just far surpassing the spirit of a normal person. And knowledge and understanding and interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Now I love that. This woman is speaking as someone who is convicted, someone who believes in Daniel and believes in Daniel's God. And perhaps that is why she was not part of this banquet, part of this party, part of the coming under the influence of these lords and these rulers who were under the influence of alcohol, worshiping the gods of gold and silver and brass and iron and wood and stone that can't see and can't hear. And of course we do the same today. You know, we worship gold and we worship idols and we worship silver, we worship metal, we worship our cars, and we worship our Oscars, and we worship our trophies, and we worship all the things of this world, and the sports, and the celebrities,
technology,
and the stars, and technology. And in a sense, we're just as out of our senses as was Belshazzar and his lords and his princes. But this woman is within reason. She's got her senses about her. She's intelligent. She's thinking. She's seen spirit. She's seen what is in Daniel and true understanding and knowledge that is in. And so she's separated from the banquet, and she's now trying to bring Belshazzar to understand and to seek for this man named Daniel.
There's another lesson here, James, that all of us need to consider, and that is that if we conduct ourselves in integrity and in mercy, even though we're believers, all of us are surrounded with people who don't necessarily believe. And wouldn't it be great if, when they come to a time of need, when they realize their need for the Lord, that they would immediately think to call upon that individual, that person, this individual, because there's an excellent spirit in them, and we have witnessed in them something that attracts us, and we know that they may have the answer and may be able to direct us to the right source of understanding and knowledge. And that's what we need, friends. We need to conduct ourselves in such a way as believers that people know that they can turn to us in their times of need and struggle and pain, and don't need to be afraid to turn to us for fear of condemnation. As chapter 5 of Daniel continues to unfold, we're going to see that Belshazzar does not respond in an appropriate way to the vision that God gives, to the handwriting on the wall. But we're going to see here also that God is good, God is merciful, and He continues to have a plan that we want ourselves to play into. So stay with us, and we'll be right back in just a moment.